The king's gambit begins with the moves pawn to e4, pawn to e5, followed by pawn to f4. In this position, your opponent will usually either capture the gambit pawn or defend their own pawn on e5. We will examine both options, starting with black defending the pawn. If black chooses to defend pawn e5, you immediately attack it again with your knight to f3. Black may respond with pawn to d6, reinforcing their central control. This position is full of interesting tactical possibilities. Here, you develop your bishop to c4, which is the most common square for this piece in the king's gambit. The bishop on c4 targets the weak f7 square, supporting your future attack. Black will often play bishop to g4, pinning your knight. This move is attractive for black because, without the pin, you could consider an aggressive jump with knight to g5, aiming for an attack similar to the fried liver attack. Black often plays bishop to g4 in this position. In response, you castle kingside. Here, black may find a tempting opportunity to play knight to d4, trying to take advantage of the pin on your knight on f3. This move appears to put pressure on your position, but in reality, the situation is quite the opposite. At this point, you completely disrupt your opponent's position with the tactical shot bishop takes f7. While this may seem like an unexpected sacrifice, it is actually a common idea in the king's gambit. The key reason behind this move is the open f-file, which you can use to launch a powerful attack. After bishop takes f7, black is forced to capture, and then you continue with knight to g5, delivering check. The idea is to win back the bishop on f7 on the next move, gaining a strong initiative. By executing this tactic, you have successfully exposed your opponent's king and severely weakened their position. There is also a funny variation that I have encountered multiple times in blitz games. In this scenario, your opponent spends some time thinking and believes they have found a way to escape the trap. They decide to capture the knight on g5, reasoning that this removes the check. Their calculation is as follows. I will eliminate the immediate threat, and, on the next move, win back my queen with a material advantage. Confident in their plan, they happily play queen takes g5, only to realize too late that they have fallen into a deeper tactical trap. At this point, you simply recapture the queen, turning the game in your favor. At this moment, you might notice a few seconds ticking by as your opponent desperately tries to capture your queen, only to be met with the frustrating beep sound of an illegal move. After a brief moment of confusion, they finally realize that after pawn takes g5, their king is actually in discovered check. This means they don't have time to capture your queen, they must first move their king. Once they do, you calmly capture the bishop, leaving yourself with a completely winning position. Most opponents will instinctively move their king backward, trying to escape. After that, you simply recapture the bishop on g4, restoring material balance while keeping a dominant position. However, your opponent might still hold on to a small glimmer of hope, noticing that they can now capture the pawn on c2, trying to create counterplay. On the next move, your opponent is likely to capture your rook, thinking they are gaining material. However, you respond with pawn takes a5, seizing the initiative. In most cases, your opponent will instinctively recapture the pawn, believing that if you check them, they can simply block and remain safe. But instead of delivering a check, you shock them with a devastating sacrifice. Rook takes f8. This forces the king to capture the rook, and now you follow up with a knight fork, attacking both the king and the queen. Additionally, the pawn on g7 is also under attack, further strengthening your position. At this point, you have successfully gained material, continued your attack on the king, and reached a completely winning position. Now, let's look at the next trap that arises when black accepts the gambit. Here, you play knight to a3, a development move that also controls the h4 square, setting up future tactical opportunities. In this position, black's main idea is to jump out with the queen and deliver a check to your king. One of the most common ways for black to continue is by playing pawn to g5. If they don't, white can simply continue with pawn to d4, regaining the gambit pawn while achieving a strong central presence and better development. To illustrate, if black plays a random move, white will occupy the center, recover the material, and gain a clear advantage. Therefore, pawn to g5 makes sense for black. First, it reinforces the pawn on f4, making it difficult for white to win it back. Second, black may even plan to push the pawn further, driving away white's knight and preparing the dangerous check with queen to h4. The idea behind pawn to g5 is to strengthen black's control and prepare counterplay. However, when you respond with pawn to h4, it often confuses opponents, especially those unfamiliar with King's Gambit theory, as it is not a mainstream opening. At this point, black realizes their mistake. If they capture on h4, their pawn structure becomes weak, allowing you to capture pawns with your rook and bishop one by one. This is a bad move for black. Normally, black would play pawn to h6 to maintain the pawn chain, but here it's tactically flawed. You can instantly capture on g5, and black can't recapture due to the pawn being pinned, risking the rook on h8. Unable to capture, black might try to push the pawn forward, but now you advance your knight, adding pressure. You can also develop your bishop to c4, targeting the weak f4 pawn and solidifying your position. Although pawn to g5 is a standard and theoretically correct move for black, it requires a good understanding of the king's gambit. Without proper knowledge, many beginners who simply want to maintain their pawn chain might be tempted to play pawn to f6, thinking, if white captures on g5, I can recapture with my f6 pawn, keeping my position solid. At first glance, this seems reasonable for black. However, instead of capturing the pawn on g5, white plays a stunning knight sacrifice on g5, completely shocking the opponent. If black captures the knight, white immediately responds with queen to h5 check, and this is practically game over. White now has a crushing attack against the exposed king, especially since the rest of black's pieces remain undeveloped. The attack continues with queen takes g5, delivering another check, further tightening white's control over the position. You also x-ray the queen on d8, adding additional pressure to black's position. They cannot easily block the check, because if they do, you play pawn to a5, and since the knight is pinned, this becomes devastating for black. Going back, in most cases, black will simply retreat their king to e8. At this point, you need to know how to properly finish the attack, as it's still possible to misplay and let the advantage slip. Then, to continue correctly, you play queen to h5, once again forcing black's king into an uncomfortable position on a7, where it blocks its own pieces and remains exposed. Next, you follow up with queen to e5, cutting off any possible defensive moves. Black cannot cover their king, as there is no queen to a7 or any other effective defense. They are forced to move the king to f7. Now, you play bishop to c4, and this marks the beginning of the end. If black attempts to escape with king to e6, you even have the option of capturing the rook, further tightening your grip on the game. You don't even need to capture the rook. You can simply chase the king and deliver checkmate. After king to g7, you play queen to f7 check, supported by the bishop. The king is forced to move, leading to a funny checkmate sequence. After king to h6, the final move is the quiet yet deadly pawn to d3, delivering checkmate with the bishop from c1 acting as a sniper. Black might try to sacrifice the queen, but it won't change the outcome. Checkmate is inevitable. The next trap is deadly. After your opponent accepts the gambit, you play knight to f3, then pawn to g5 as usual. But you deviate with knight to c3, seeming like a mistake. Your opponent plays pawn to g4, and then you play knight to e5. They respond with queen to h4, thinking they have a strong attack. Now you're in a tough spot. Moving the king forward is risky, and pawn to g3 seems bad, as black can just capture the pawn. It seems like you're in trouble, but there's a prepared response. You play queen takes g4, attacking the queen on h4. Black could trade queens and enter an equal endgame, but you still have some initiative with moves like knight to d5, targeting a knight takes c7 fork. However, most opponents will realize the real threat and play pawn to g2, delivering a check. After you seemingly win the queen, black regains it and captures your rook on the corner. Black thinks they outsmarted you, believing your king is exposed and they're about to win, but that's not the case. The issue for black is their underdevelopment, and their queen is stuck on h1 with almost no available squares, as they're all controlled by white. In this position, queen to h5 is very strong, attacking pawn to f7 and threatening a checkmate similar to Scholar's Mate. Thanks for watching.